Hello, we're now live. Thank you very much for joining me. Welcome. And I have a canvas right behind me because eventually we're going to be doing some Bob Ross type painting stuff. Everybody who paints live probably does not have to reference Bob Ross, but Bob Ross was, along with Sesame Street and The Muppet Show and lots of shows like that, Mr. Wizard and stuff like that, comes to mind often as part of my childhood media experience. I hope you can hear me in TV land. I want to say hello out there real quick. And the reason we're broadcasting live, pardon my restoration Meg Ryan look at the moment. If you haven't seen the movie Restoration with Robert Downey Jr. and Meg Ryan, I highly recommend it. And it's a very good, humorous look at the Charles II reign of England, and some eccentric physicians at that time, and a particular Irish patient, which gives them a whole lot of trouble, played by Meg Ryan. But anyway, and she's particularly a great character in it, but I don't want to spoil too much of the plot because it's worth checking out. So Restoration, the film, and it's from the early 90s, so early to mid 90s. Anyway, part of the reason that I wanted to broadcast was because I had to, at one point, do an artist's statement. And so I headed up this presentation. I'm very uncomfortable with artist statements or like curriculum vitae or the resume process, unless I can include like 4 pages of handwritten material at all times, going into depth of all of my influences. So I wanted to talk about my main focuses over the course of my career, and what we kind of touch on the channel here, or what I had intended through my writing. So part of my main interest is in Post-Modernism, which is a recombination of all prior historic influences. It has multicultural themes and applies them universally. It strives towards inclusion as a focus. And there is a validation of simultaneous pluralistic truths, which is the definition of postmodern philosophies. This is done so that the individuality is exalted, personal choices. So like the free will of the individual is ultimately respected for the most part, if at all possible, congruently with the larger society. So that sincerity and that authenticity is recognized by the group, ideally, and this leads to an ease and understanding of the individual and their part to play in various groups. So as a sociologist, that's kind of my understanding of the individual versus the whole, with regard to the exalted individuality of market research. They're striving to ask questions on polls or hypotheticals, which I find very fascinating. I find it very fascinating that crowdsourcing or poll sourcing, just doing things kind of off the cuff that's like a standard for voicing one's own opinions at the moment. So, and being recognized if you want to buy something or have something made specifically for you or your nearest and dearest, several made. It sort of starts off like that, and then it snowballs as a concept in the entrepreneurial genre right now, with crowdsourcing both information as well as resources or things like that. I find that very fascinating. The public democracy of it, of the mass media convergence. So anyway, uh, I was also going to talk about the golden mean as relates to postmodernism. It seems that divine proportion is very much making a comeback. Sacred geometries, certainly. Alternative healing modalities, um, whatever that portends to you in your life, however you choose to pick up on that. Um, the augmented concept, augmented longevity concept, the concept that we could take care of ourselves or go certain places or do certain things that might make us want to strive to flourish more and nurture more. So not only others but ourselves, also, keeping uh, the group um, vitalized. So that vibration and that frequency is often spoken of. Uh, Forgive me if I somehow am little distracted because I'm doing updates also at the same time, and so things pop up. But anyway, I'm so happy to be with you live like this on things as I find them, and then eventually I'll turn them into actual videos or draw at the same time I make these. At the moment, I kind of misplaced a cable. A charging cable for a camera. So this is what you get in the middle of the night on a Friday. Let's see. So some of my influences throughout my life have been things like musicology. Um, so Alan Lomax, the Smithsonian remastering and digitalization thing that they do, digitization of old films and music. That's really fascinating to me. The intersectionality of just culture, like Bell Hooks is a great hero of mine, as well as Henry Jenkins, and I have a lot of respect for Immanuel Kant as well. And I always pause because Kant, he obviously could. Uh, so semiotics is a very big one for me. It pretty much goes along with any language, and I like very obscure languages sometimes. So languages which very few people actually spend a lot of time learning. Those are the ones that always catch my attention and that somehow I pick up on more readily in terms of sound. And it's that hearing of every syllable that makes me kind of want to switch over into a different language entirely and start listening to media just in that language and picking up books and trying to figure it out in terms of reading and writing. So when it's something like Gaelic or Algonquin or Iroquois, kind of Cherokee, it's got to be something like really, like Ojibwa or something. It's like really interesting to me. Um, Dutch is not spoken by all that many people around the world, so Dutch comes really naturally. Spanish comes very naturally to me, but to speak it, I have to be in the rhythm and spend some time listening to like television or music or something, and then it works. So I just kind of fall out of the rhythm and the pace. Um, and my Spanish is kind of stuck somewhere around like sixth grade, probably. Although I took it like all through school, um, every chance I got, it was always Spanish. So I think that I'm somewhat old fashioned, so it's very Castilian and lots of nosotros and vosotros, and they don't use vosotros anymore in most Spanish speaking places, and ustedes and very formal. And my Dutch is very much like that too. So anyway, it's Victorian Dutch. It's aangenaam kennis te maken. Yeah, I've heard it on the recording, but it's not exactly Rosetta Stone. Got this kind of like gung ho kind of language. Um, it's kind of like, well, I've got this to a point, and then I can work on it if need be. um, and so far, like my grades in various languages, they don't really seem to have anything to do with how I'm picking up on the language at all. So I don't know. I test weird always. But other things that I really like as an artist is the National Historic Preservation Society, the architectural conservation portion. I kind of believe that various time periods in history had really unique solutions for their environmental stuffs that saved them in terms of energy expenditures at all, but made them more comfortable. And these were incorporated in things like transom windows above doorways to allow heat to escape and cool air to come in, and things like that, so air to circulate. And I think often about like places that you can't open a window, or they're completely reliant on air conditioning all the time being pumped in. Without the solar aspect to that, or wind turbines or water power, it's very impractical to cool or heat certain places without geothermal, and that kind of thing. So I'm very fascinated by architecture that is old, that solved problems that we still have today, that perhaps our current architecture does not solve as well. And you can especially see these play out when you use computers to analyze stuff, and when you have raw data to crunch in statistics. But I prefer the aesthetics of things like the Queen Anne architectural style, or the 1920s kit houses of Sears and Roebuck, or something like that. Or even the colonial Dutch New England homes of the Delaware, and that kind of thing is so fascinating because of their incorporations of how to do laundry, where to do laundry, how to have it dry, how to have smoking things, smoking your meats while you make all your food and you can things, and where you put the cans, and all of this like use of tiny spaces to like basically prepare everything is fascinating to me. And have like you're smoking the meat by cooking what you're cooking that day. And I find that very fascinating, that just by boiling water you're already sterilizing like everything in the house, uh, kind of thing, when you do your laundry. And so I'm fascinated, very fascinated by various cultures' appliances, and you know, how their household appliances are made smaller than the ones in the U.S., or there's some factor of individual convenience or affordability that isn't available to us here. And I find this design very interesting. So, other things besides design and the Cooper Hewitt Museum, which I'm passionate about, we have a national design museum, and it's called the Cooper Hewitt, and they have the a large collection of dollhouses and toys and things, but also all kinds of household goods. So like toasters or hats, or all of the dresses from the first ladies from, I think, Dolly Madison on down, kind of thing. So great admiration. Um, let's see. Art history. Some of my favorite artists are Frida Kahlo, Marcel Duchamp, and Mondrian. And so I try to use those in my work. Um, they're as influences, their own works, but they are all artists who had vast personalities and biographies and tumultuous times that they lived through, and just exciting times. So, you know, I think of them often just as writers also, and just their concept of their own biographies, their life stories, and things that people said about their lives. They're so fantastic to me. So I tend to go towards occult folklore mythology when I'm telling stories, and that's very much a Joseph Campbell thing. But I'm going to mention Alan Watts too. Alan Watts is very much one of my favorite people to hear remixed into dance music, along with Timothy Leary. So, you know, there's several people who just like their voices work so well for remixing, and I would like to make those suggestions more. Self-help stuff generally works really well for passionate speeches and self-motivation tapes and things like that. I like to hear those put to happy music. So the occult myths of rock and roll is something that I'm very fixated with, and I'll probably like try to write an actual book about it someday. Maybe just like fairy tale stories kind of things. Um, but you know, like for example, I was listening to a song the other day that was Little Red Riding Hood, and I hadn't heard it for decades, and used to hear it all the time. And it's been done by multiple artists, and it's basically the story of Little Red Riding Hood, but with a rock and roll twist. And a lot of stories from songs are kind of like that, where they have this very fascinating ghost story or um, legend having to do with the song. And so I would like to someday make a book of at least a first volume of some ghost stories and legends having to do with that. Uh, but that's a big project, and um, I keep working on it. Many pieces. So, to that puzzle. Another one that I'm very fascinated with is metaphysics, and this almost needs a dictionary. But I've been studying astrology and the Vedas and transcendental meditation and yoga most of my life. And I've just been very focused on that in probably the best way, because I feel that it's given me a lot. more than, I've given to it or could ever give to it back. So I feel that that's a good lifestyle for me to aspire towards. Not necessarily I've attained all this and so I hope you attain it too. It's more like I'm there and I love to share it. So, that's kind of just part of my thing. And I don't really claim it to be like a hippie thing. I think that hippies have their time and their time is still going on. So I'm not a hippie. I am a Gen Xer and a punk. I'm very proud of this. I'm the very edge of the Gen Xer punks. I think I couldn't be born later and still be a Gen Xer punk, but I'm very happy that I am in some way alternative. I am truly alternative. Before, like, it became part of the alternative charts or alternative billboard or whatever, alternative fashion. Um, but since I can't be really alternative, I get to be a punk again, I guess. All right. So that brings me into counterculture. It's another thing I'm interested in. Psychedelic era American studies. So the psychic studies, as well as like psychology and self-improvement and, everything that entails. And even if I'm not into something like barefoot running on beaches at 5 in the morning every morning, I'm still really fascinated by people who are really into that. I want to know how they enjoy it and what they do to enjoy it more and how long they've been doing that and how they make it work. And, I'm just kind of fascinated by people's lifestyles and what makes them happy, which always reminds me of the country of Bhutan because they had a gross domestic happiness factor for a while instead of a gross domestic product, and I thought that was really fascinating. I think it was Bhutan. Please excuse me if I've got my countries mixed up. So let's see. Critical thinking. So humanism is a big one for me. And so in the Renaissance period, there you could say people liked the Enlightenment a lot. I like humanism. No matter what form it comes in, humanism is always good by me. And so I'm really into Jung and Lacan and Sartre and Camus as like quotes. They're my go-to guys. So critical thinking, that's mostly what I pay attention to whenever I read stuff. I'm really into medicine in a big way, particularly color therapies and sound binaural therapies, light, aroma, like the 8 paths of yoga, the 12 Raj yogas, all of the noble paths, and yeah. So creativity and disease. So I've been thinking usually when I'm contemplating the biographies of various artists and writers and creative thinkers, I'm usually thinking about what they had to grapple with during their lifetimes. However, their situations may have contributed to their decision-making process or, their life's careers. So I'm thinking often about how a person's physiology or their psychology or whatever can go into co-creating some great art. And so that leads me to audio production to wrap up. which I sort of made a mashup for a while. I make up mini mashups and then I kind of like misplace them over time. Um, and so I think about half of them usually end up surviving because at some point I get nervous about releasing material and and decide to hold stuff back and a bunch of other stuff, and then at some point it gets kind of like scattered to the winds or saved in the wrong place or something, and I'll discover it years later. Which is how we end up on videos like this, where I find a PowerPoint presentation and decide that, hey, maybe now's a good time to reuse it as an introduction to how I spend my working life in some ways doing creative things and thinking about creative thinkers. So, with that, I leave you, good listener, and I sincerely appreciate your time listening to all of this. I do some painting, I do some website work, I do some photography, I do some video production, as you've probably noticed, and some collage work, some digital art. So I have a portfolio of, and some writing. And at this point, that's what I can think of um, to actually talk about, other than my poetry, um, books, that kind of thing. Trying to, I have written a book. I'm not sure about self-publishing. It's a book sort of about astral projection. So, and it's very nice and it has nice illustrations and things like that. It's about dreaming and eating and being peaceful and stuff like that, and going and visiting outer space and coming back and waking up from and feeling good. So I thought it was a nice book. um, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with everyone eventually. But I'm also always working on various other things. So hopefully I'll be sharing those in future videos, such as some new astrology stuff, which I've just come up with. And I'll talk a little bit about doing something, a project having to do with the astrology a little bit more. And more stuff about art and creativity, like we usually cover. But I also would love to cover some historic figures' biographies, and things like that. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks so much for hanging out, and I hope you're all having a wonderful weekend. And I'll be back on soon. So take care. Appreciate it, and many, many blessings. Much love. Thank you for your support.